And our top story this hour comes in from France, where Paris is on lockdown. The French capital is witnessing the third week of yellow vest protests. Thousands of French security forces have fanned out to tackle the protesters. What you can see are live visuals coming in from Paris. As you can see, the protesters have rallied on the streets of Paris near Champs-Élysées. All security arrangements have been made to ensure peace and avoid another outbreak of violence during the protests. The demonstrations are underway despite the government having scrapped fuel tax increases and frozen electricity and gas prices for 2019. And to bring us more details on this news story, I am joined in by our correspondent Elena Casas-Montanez, our correspondent who joins us live from Paris with all the latest details. Elena, you're covering this tirelessly from ground zero. Give us a sense of the protests out there. What are the security arrangements looking like?
Well, as you can see, groups of yellow vest protesters are gathering fairly peacefully so far behind me in central Paris this morning. But there is an atmosphere of tension, a fairly eerie atmosphere, with most shops boarded up here around the Place de la Bastille where we are. And as you were saying, museums and tourist attractions closed. The police are taking no chances. At the last count, they've arrested 317 people this morning. That's mostly from searching bags and cars. Everyone here is being subjected to a bag search before they enter the square. And most of the people arrested have been found with a weapon or something that they could use as a weapon. The police say they found things like petanque balls and baseball bats in people's bags. So they really have locked down much of the city. There are 8,000 police on duty today. That's a lot more than last Saturday, where of course we saw those violent scenes and the worst rioting in central Paris in 50 years. So the security services are taking no chances on that happening again.
Right, Elena, very rightly mentioned that this is the worst violent protest in the last 50 years. But, you know, it's important to talk about how these yellow vest protests or the Gilets jaunes is taking place just in the weeks which are leading up to Christmas. How has this entire protest actually impacted business in Paris?
Well, it obviously has a serious impact, especially on a day like today when many businesses are being forced to close. According to a recent poll, 1 in 4 French people have already decided not to buy something or cancelled a shopping trip because they were worried about being disrupted by yellow vest protests. Of course, this doesn't just apply to these violent protests that we're seeing each Saturday in the capital. The yellow vests have also set up blockades all across the country on motorways and at roundabouts where they're often stopping all the cars. So that does dissuade people from going out. And of course, it's also putting off tourists. We spoke earlier in the week to hotel associations which say they have seen a steep drop in bookings, a steep number of cancellations from foreign tourists. And some countries, of course, are recommending their citizens not to visit Paris in the coming weeks. So all of that will have an economic impact on the city.
Right, it is already having that economic impact, Elena. It's important to talk about the nature of these protests. Run us through, how the Gilets jaunes is structureless. It emerged from the social media, putting up some very diverse demands. What is it that makes these protests stand out particularly and so potent and volatile?
Well, they're unique historically for exactly that reason, that people organise themselves spontaneously on social media. It's not connected to any political party or any union, and indeed political parties on both the left and the right and the unions have found it very difficult to attach themselves to the movement or take any credit for it. That, of course, creates the problem that it has no leadership and indeed is very anti-leadership. 8 people last week were named spokespeople for the movement, but then they were later turned on by other yellow vests who said they weren't legitimate and they didn't want them speaking for them. And they cancelled a meeting with the Prime Minister, these spokespeople, because they said they'd received death threats from other yellow vests. So it certainly is very diverse. For every protester you speak to, really, you hear different aims. There's a list circulating on social media with a range of things that some yellow vests say that they want, which includes everything from raising the minimum wage to France pulling out of the European Union. So these certainly aren't aims which would be shared by all of the protesters. It is a very diverse movement. What's brought people together, though, is worry about the cost of living and about their spending power and just not being able to get to the ends of the month, people say, without having to make difficult choices, like between eating and paying their heating bill.
Right. Elena, also if we look at the yellow vest protesters, they seem to be rioting and protesting actually relentlessly. This is indeed the first test of presidency for President Emmanuel Macron.
It's the first serious test of Emmanuel Macron's presidency, and it's already forced him, of course, into one major U-turn. Earlier this week, the government reversed the decision that originally sparked these protests to raise fuel taxes from January the 1st of next year. That's done very little, though, to calm public anger. Perhaps it would have done if it had been announced 2 weeks ago, but when it came, it was too little, too late for the protesters, and it looks like the government will be forced into a serious change of policy direction to calm these protests. Macron, of course, was elected on a controversial reform programme, which he promised that he would push through, and he said during the election campaign that he wouldn't be stopped by street protests, because every other previous French president who's tried to push through reforms has faced street protests, not necessarily as violent as these, but protests that have forced them to back down. And Macron said that he would change the course of history, and he wouldn't do that. But it does look like that if he is to continue in power, he is going to need to make some radical policy changes.
Right. Elena, on a last note, I'd like to ask you, what are the challenges ahead now for the Macron government?
Well, Macron is set to speak at the beginning of next week, and what he says, I think, will depend on what happens today. It will depend on how widespread and indeed how violent these demonstrations are. The government has considered, or at least some of the cabinet ministers have talked about considering policy changes like raising the minimum wage or bringing in a wealth tax, which was scrapped by Macron last year. He says he doesn't want to change course on any of what he considers the key planks of his economic policy. But there's a huge amount of discontent on France's streets, discontent that's been boiling for decades, it would be fair to say. Many people are angry not just about the current administration, but about decisions that have been made by presidents of the left and the right going back for years. But with European elections, of course, in 5 months' time, if Macron is to retake control of France and to bring the situation back under control, he is going to have to make a serious change of direction.
Right, a serious change of direction, all to be determined after today's Grand March that's already underway. Thank you so much, Elena, for bringing us all the latest details from Paris.